Before I introduce Dr. Cook, I did want to run through, you've heard some of their names mentioned already, but I think they all deserve to be recognized. I'm going to mention some names, and if you could join me in some applause for them at the end. My center deputy director, Major Goff, was crucial in every aspect of the planning and execution. Dr. Ed Barrett, the Director of Research, continues to amaze me as to how he finds the best speakers around to engage during our McCain conference. Dr. Sean Baker is one of our Associate Directors. He's actually with our U.S. Naval Academy Ethics Bowl team, competing right now, but he did all the registration. Lieutenant Commander Misty Odom, who helped at various times during this two-day session. Marge Bem over there, who's the exquisite event planner. I have a large family, and I have 3 daughters still to get married, and I'm counting on Marge to be available for all of those. Jacqueline Dana, who is out front for the 2 days, taking care of everybody as they came in. General John Sattler, our distinguished chair of leadership, who secured General Pace, one of his former bosses. Mr. Mitt Regan, who is our distinguished chair in ethics, who presented and also participated in various areas of this. Kathy Kindig, who was running the computer and made sure that every PowerPoint was up, is not actually part of the Stockdale Center, but she lives in Luce Hall where we are, and she's our IT guru. We thank you for Seth, who is here filming moment by moment to capture what goes on here. And the resident fellows, Dr. Michael Skirker and Dr. Jeff Black and Dr. Michael Robillard, again, all who participated. And it's just a great team effort to make this happen. So if you could give them a round of applause. So the final keynote speaker is a longtime friend of the Stockdale Center and a loyal participant in the McCain Conference over the years. Dr. Cook is the Admiral Stockdale Professor of Professional Military Ethics at the United States Naval War College. He previously served as a professor of philosophy and deputy department head for the Department of Philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's also served as professor of ethics and Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies at the U.S. Army War College and tenured member of the Santa Clara University faculty. So he has joint as well as civil military combinations throughout his career. Dr. Cook serves as a co-editor of the Journal of Military Ethics and as a member of the editorial board of Parameters, the scholarly journal of the Army War College, and the Journal of Military Medical Ethics. He's the author of 3 books and the co-author of a 4th, and has written more than 45 scholarly articles. On a personal note, as a Marine, I have observed a recent renaissance within the Navy in the area of ethics and professionalism. John Myers, who's here, has certainly been a part of that, but this renaissance has really been driven to a large degree by Dr. Cook's thoughtful and insightful writings and presentations. So it really is my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Martin Cook to wrap us up and give us our final thoughts before we depart. Dr. Cook.
Well, I must say I'm honored that you're here at all. I figured as the last guy on Friday afternoon, I would be talking to myself. But what I thought I would try to do is sketch the long historical sweep of American civil-military relations to sort of see where the kind of dilemmas that Basevich articulated so well for us come from, and the degree to which the vision of the founders makes it very difficult in the contemporary situation to figure out how to apply those initial civil principles to the contemporary situation. So to start with the blinding flash of the obvious in the US Constitution, our founders were very worried to avoid standing armies. This was largely based on their belief that republics that had large armies did not remain republics. So they were absolutely determined to subordinate any military forces they authorized to the civilian authority. And indeed, let's remind ourselves that one of the central complaints of the Declaration of Independence is, and I quote, "King George has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power." So if you read the Constitution carefully, which we do every term in my elective, the Stockdale elective, you'll notice right off the bat that the intent was that the Congress was going to be the primary actor. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution reads, Congress shall have the power to declare war, to raise and to support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for the calling forth of the militias. So now if you think about that, the Congress has the power to raise an army, assuming that you don't normally have one. And if you remember in the details of the Constitution, it says you can only do that for 2 years, and you need to reauthorize it at the second year. So there's a navy, and there are the state militias in normal times. That's the only military forces provided for explicitly by the Constitution. And notice the militias can be called forth into federal service under some circumstances. I like to point out this little fact. When I taught at Carlisle, if anybody been to Carlisle? You walk in the front door and you turn left. I think it's still there. There's a painting of George Washington leading an army through the streets of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. What was he doing? He was taking the Pennsylvania militia, and he was the commander-in-chief in direct command of the militia to go suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. The only time a president has ever taken to the field with the army for a specific deployment. So in Article 2, of course, the president is designated the commander-in-chief, but note that in normal times, this meant very little, because what did he have available to him? He had a navy, period. He had a navy. The state militias normally worked for the governors unless they were federalized. So the idea was, partly in reaction to the decentralization of the Articles of Confederation, the recognition that if you actually had to go to war, you did want unity of command, but it was not perceived that this would be any kind of threat to the subordination of the military to civil authorities, because in normal times there is no army, so they can't use it for nefarious purposes. So to speak of the third branch of government, of course, after Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court decision of 1803, the Supreme Court was established as the final arbiter of the constitutionality of law and policy. So if you think about this in terms of separation of church and state, the military really has three masters. It has the Congress, it has the executive branch, and it has the federal judiciary. Another article that is often neglected, but I think is very important, and I point it out to my students every term, is Article 6, which says, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which will be made in pursuance thereof, and this is the italicized part, what comes next, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So we were talking the other day about the possibility of manifestly illegal orders. And one of the things I think is important to point out to all military officers is, if you're being ordered to violate a ratified treaty, that's an illegal order. So if you're being told to violate the Geneva Convention, for example, that is a manifestly illegal order. Most of our military people don't know that, by the way. I will tell you, when I point it out to them, it surprises them. So I think we have some serious difficulties in terms of the constitutional literacy of our officer corps. When they read it with me, few of them have read it within the last 15 years, I think, and so forth. So there's some work to be done. There's a brilliant Air Force lawyer out at the Air Force Academy, Linnell Latondra, who gave a wonderful talk at the War College called Constitutional Ethics. And by the way, we have our own YouTube channel, so if you go to YouTube and put Naval War College Ethics in the search block, you'll get the last 7.5 years of ethics conferences. And Linnell has been there a couple of times. I would highly recommend looking at that talk by her. She and I are probably going to write an article, at least, maybe a book on constitutional ethics next year. Okay, so that was the baseline constitutional norm. Now, and indeed, as we saw, the tradition in the US was to demobilize the Army to practically nothing after every major war. So even as we talked about last time, what was Patton doing between World War I and World War II? You know, going to French schools. What was Eisenhower doing? Working for the Civilian Conservation Corps in the Pacific Northwest. The small little officer cadre that remained between the major wars went to school a lot, and they went to Leavenworth and studied there. But obviously this all changed in a big way following World War II. And so One of the deep historical questions, if like me you tend to think in blocks of centuries and not of decades, is to what degree is the situation that evolved after World War II still a necessary way of organizing ourselves? Or to what degree is it in fact dysfunctional for us in that it leads to the kind of things that Andy Vasevich is so articulate about criticizing, about the overuse of the military force because it's there and because it's, the authorities under which it's regulated are not very clear. So, blinding flash of the obvious, after World War II, especially with the rise of the Soviet Union, it became apparent that for the first time in American history, we would have large standing military forces other than the Navy in a kind of quasi-peacetime, and that was going to be absolutely necessary. One of my favorite documents in American history is Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, in which he famously warned of the extreme dangers this presented to American democracy. And that's where the phrase, the rise of the power of the military-industrial complex, was first coined. And Eisenhower is a remarkable guy for explicitly articulating that this will be dangerous to American democracy. And unless you watch it very, very carefully, he says only an alert public can watch this to make, and he says this power will grow, not always because it's chosen. Sometimes it'll just grow like Topsy because it becomes a thing that runs of itself and will be almost impossible to regulate. So as Andy articulated very well today, anybody ever paid attention to trying to close even one military base? You know, what happens, predictably, is the local congressional delegation fights it tooth and nail. If you're a clever defense contractor, you arrange to have your weapon system built in as many states as possible to make it almost politically unstoppable, because although as individuals, Congress members might recognize the excessive cost or even the undesirability of the weapon system, as a political matter, they've got so embedded into their districts that they look like jobs. Okay, so we've got standing military forces, large standing military forces, which would have horrified the founders. We've also fought many wars without congressional resolutions, certainly not declarations of war, often rather vague things like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution for Vietnam, or the current authorization for the use of military force, which has been stretched beyond all recognition of its original intent to deal with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates. That said, I'm sure you know, President Obama has repeatedly asked the Congress to give him new authorizations to replace the AUMF, because he himself recognizes that this is legally very sketchy to be continuing doing what we're doing on the strength of that level of congressional authorization. But as Andy also pointed out, the Congress has zero appetite to take this up, and there's no indication that they're going to. So, bottom line, Congress has essentially abdicated its responsibility to fully debate use of force at all. You add that to a standing military force, and the inevitable result is the growth of executive power, which uses these military forces at its sole discretion without needing to ask permission, or in many cases realizing even if it did, the Congress wouldn't do anything about it, so they just have to sort of act on their own authority to do what they want. As we heard over lunch, the abolition of the draft led, among other things, to the abandonment of what the founders considered absolutely essential, which is our wars would be fought by citizen soldiers, drawn from the state militias, and therefore deeply connected to the society that they serve. And as we've already talked about many times over the course of the last 2 days, what we see, in fact, is the growth of a large professional military force, which is increasingly separated from the society it serves. When Admiral Mullen was the chairman, he used to say, when asked, what's the number one thing you're worried about? He said, the number one thing I worry about is we don't know the American people and they don't know us, and that's what keeps me up at night. And we've seen all the reasons why that separation and isolation happens. Some of it's geographic, some of it's cultural, but it's certainly a very pernicious phenomenon. One of the great visitors we have at the War College, we've had him now 3 times, just had him this week earlier, is a fellow named Karl Marlantes. Anybody ever read any of Karl's work? If you're going to read one war memoir in your life, read What It Is Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes, or go watch him on our YouTube channel if you want. But one of the themes he articulates very well is the sort of gulf between the veteran and the civilians. the sort of fear on both sides to have a conversation about what military service is. So on the part of the civilians, the kind of fear that you'll upset them, or that they're all damaged, or it'll awaken some unpleasant memory that they don't want to deal with, and fear on the part of the veteran, if they're really honest about the things they've done. Even if they did only things that were necessary to do, they're still horrific, right? Now, there's still things that would the average civilian think that they were incapable of doing. Well, in fact, they're not. But Carl articulates that all very well. So, what do we get out of that? We get a risk of using a military force that's not deeply connected to the American people, controlled almost exclusively by the executive branch. Ask yourself, by the way, I'm a child of the Vietnam generation. I went to college in 1969, so if you remember your ancient history, you remember what my freshman year was like. That was the Kent State killings, the invasion of Cambodia, riots on every campus. I got an A in logic because it was impossible to go to class after midterm for all the bomb threats. So that worked out really well for me in logic, but probably explains my poor reasoning capabilities to this day. But anyway, it was a really chaotic time. But could you have could you have done what we've done in the last 15 years if you had a draftee force? I submit it would be impossible. The American people wouldn't have put up with it. If every household had sons and daughters going to these wars over a period of more than a decade, it would have been politically unsustainable. So it's sustainable because, on the one hand, you get that stuff about, we respect our military. But on the other hand, we really don't know anything about it. We don't know what you guys do. And at some deeper level, I think many civilians actually feel kind of sorry for you, right? I'm sort of glad. I mean, have you really defended the country in what you've been doing in the last 15 years? Really? I mean, can you make that case? I mean, we paper this over with glib talk about national defense, but what have we got to show for all this strategically? And what do we say to the returning veteran, honestly, about what they've sacrificed for that purpose? So, now, one of the things that's emerged a lot in the DoD in the last few years, and this all started in the Army, of course, with Dr. Don Snyder's work on the Army as a profession. A book that every service should probably look at, if you haven't, is Snyder's collection of essays called The Future of the Army Profession, which is a collection of essays by 50 or so authors, taking the sociological concept of what a profession is, and then trying to ask, how do we balance the bureaucratic side of the military with the professional side of the military, and why does it matter to try to get that right? And our current president, Admiral Howe, gave a great talk last fall at Convocation. We said, I've been in the Navy, 25 years. I've heard this talk about profession a little bit, but it never really meant much to me besides being tactically competent. But now that I've been hanging out with you guys for a year, I understand that this is actually a war-fighting imperative, as he would put it. Say, bureaucracies don't win wars; professions win wars. And so, when does the professional judgment have to be brought to bear on these kind of things? So, General Dempsey, of course, when he was the chairman, was basically channeling Don Snyder when he talked about the profession. He wrote this document, the white paper, America's Military, a Profession of Arms, which is available on the website, and is very much Snyder's language. You probably know that a few years ago, then Secretary Hagel appointed Admiral Peg Klein to be the ethics czar for the entire DoD, working for the Secretary. And in that capacity, our little group is the Navy's cell for this dialogue. So she's been convening video teleconferences of all of the services about once every 6 weeks, comparing best practices, building common vocabulary. We actually had a summit meeting of all the people doing ethics and profession stuff in all of the services out in Colorado Springs back in February, first time only. And if you think about it, that's a remarkable feat all by itself, because where's the budget to do that come from, right? Because normally all of that stuff would be paid for out of the services. So who's going to pay to bring people from all the services to a common place and have that dialogue? Well, it happened, and it was very helpful. And what's happened is each of the services has created an institutional instantiation of where this profession talk is supposed to be transmitted to the service. So for the Army, it's the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic, CAPE, up at West Point. So that's cape.army.mil. And for you mids out there, I recommend you go to the website because it's got cool stuff on there like video games, ethics video games. and you play the video game, you're a platoon leader, you make decisions in the game. Depending on the quality of your decisions, good or bad things happen in the game. So it's aimed at the lowest level of enlisted soldier to play it and make it real for them. What does this feel like? That's the granddaddy of the rest of the organization I'm about to mention. But definitely go to cape.army.mil and check that out. The Air Force just 18 months or so stood up an organization called PACE, which is the Profession of Arms Center of Excellence in San Antonio. They have been wildly effective in the short time that they've existed. They're actually they're working themselves to death because everywhere they go in the Air Force, people like them so much that the unit on the other side of the base wants them to come back the next week. And so they gave some staggering statistics about how much they've been on the road, going around talking to the Air Force over the last year and a half or so. But they've gotten some really good stuff on their website as well. In Newport, our old, what used to be the Command Leadership School, got rebranded as the Navy Leadership and Ethics Center. And so the grand vision for that over time is that NLEC will become a repository of resources, training materials, videos, world-class website to push out to the fleet materials to do this kind of training at the unit level and so forth. Due to the decentralized nature of the Navy, we quickly concluded that the Army's centralized approach through CAPE would work for the Army, but would never work for the Navy, because we are, such disparate communities. And then for the Marines, of course, there is the Lejeune Leadership Institute. So my point is that this language of profession is becoming the lingua franca across the DoD for how people try to ground an ethic that can be articulated, grounded in loyalty to the Constitution in a secular way, so it doesn't depend on people's different religious or philosophical opinions, and provides a kind of common ground language throughout the services. So profession language is rapidly becoming pervasive. If you haven't run into it yet in your service, you certainly will be seeing it soon. Having said that, the very fact that we're adopting this language of profession, I think, leads to some really interesting potential problems in civil-military relations. So that's what I want to try to articulate now. First of all, what do we mean to say that, that the military is a profession? Well, here are some of the features of what professions in the robust sociological sense look like. Professions have expert knowledge. People gain this knowledge over a long period of time. They engage in continuing education. And it's unethical not to do it, right? So if you met a surgeon who said, I do the surgery the way they taught me in medical school 10 years ago, I haven't read a journal since, that's an unethical surgeon, right? It is their job to be up on this. It's their job to be keeping intellectually current. So I would submit that for any true profession, both having expert knowledge and continually developing the knowledge is part of the ethic of what it is to be a profession. Professions have an internal ethic. There are things that they say, this is who we are, and this is what we do. So for example, it came up a couple sessions ago, a physician should not, in conscience, participate in torture. In fact, one of our colleagues at the War College was a medical service officer in Guantanamo, and he realized only in retrospect that some of what he was arranging treatment for on the detainees were injuries secondary to torture. And this raised serious ethical problems for him as, yes, a naval officer, but also as a medical profession. Professions bear a direct responsibility to serve the interests of their client to the best of their ability. So in the case of the U.S. military, the client is the United States and the people of the United States. So if you are lazy, ill-prepared, don't think ahead of the problem, don't think very carefully about what weapon systems we ought to be acquiring for future combat, you are failing in your ethical responsibility to your client by not being ready to deal with that. Now, if those things are true of professions, note what follows. There are some things a client might ask a professional to do that they would be duty-bound to refuse to do because of their professional ethic. Let me repeat that. If you are really a profession, and you have your own internal ethic, then your client might ask you to do something which you are duty-bound by your professional ethic to refuse to do. So what are some examples? And indeed, not to refuse would be unprofessional and therefore professionally unethical. So for example, I'm an attorney and my client asks me to fudge the rules of evidence. If I were to do so, I would be an unethical attorney. It is my job, my commitment to the judicial system fairness overall, that we all play by the same rules of evidence, right? So to withhold evidence would be professionally unethical for me. Or a physician being asked by a patient to perform a procedure or offer a treatment that is clearly not medically indicated or is outside the standard of care of the community. A conscientious physician ought to refuse that, no matter how much the patient asks them to do it. You say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. This is not professionally appropriate that I do this. Now, this kind of professional discretion is clearest when you think about the old day of the solo practice professional working on their own. So the attorney in the office by him or herself with the one shingle out there, or the doc in individual practice and so forth. But in the modern world, of course, most professionals don't work in those kind of environments anymore. Most professionals are also embedded in bureaucracies of various sizes and scale and scope. And so we've got to think about it. So imagine you're a physician working for Kaiser Permanente, for example, the big HMO chain in California. Is there going to be tension between what the bureaucracy wants in terms of cost control and what you as a physician judge to be the most appropriate thing to give to your patient? Yes, of course, right? It's inevitable that there will be that tension. And what we'd expect the professional to do is to fight like hell to get what their patient needs, even recognizing that they work for this larger money, for-profit bureaucracy. So, now let's come back to our question. Does the military conform to this model of what it is to be a profession? Well, let me ask a few questions about this. Are there things that civilian leadership might ask or order military professionals to do that they can and should refuse? In my own judgment, no matter what the White House counsel said about torture, nobody in the U.S. military should have done it. Back to the ratified treaty rule, right? This is clear that we not only ratified the Geneva Convention, we also ratified a treaty against torture. So a ratified treaty is the law of the land, and anybody who tries to tell you otherwise, I don't care if it comes from the White House or where it comes from, is giving you an illegal order. And do we prepare people to know that? Of course we don't. But what would it be to do so? I'll get back to that in a minute. What about you've got an operational plan for a military engagement insisted upon by civilian leaders, despite strong military advice that it's unwise, unworkable, or foolish. We saw this example to some degree with Tony Franks being rolled by the Bush administration. I don't know General Franks personally, but I do know General Newbold, who resigned over this, or retired early is what he actually did, but was in the plan shop and said, I've seen the war plan. It stinks. I don't want to be here when it's executed. And then eventually he went public to talk about it, but why did he talk about it? He said, I went to the burn unit and saw all these burned soldiers and thought, I bear some responsibility for this. I didn't do everything I could to stop it before it went down. I wrote an article about this in Parameters some years ago called The Revolt of the Generals, in which I actually defended the public criticism of the SecDef by these four retired flag officers. Don Snyder and I initially had a big disagreement about this. He's now come 80% my direction on this. But Dick Cohn and Peter Fever are the opposite end of this, by the way. So this is a lively debate about whether what I'm now saying is really true. There are plenty of smart people who think I'm dead wrong about this, that it's too disruptive to good order and discipline to even raise the possibility that you might say, I can't in conscience do that. But same thing I often think about my friend John Campbell, and I wonder, at what point, I know you all know John, right? He'd come on the TV and he'd give you this real positive spin on what's going on in Afghanistan. He's a very smart man. I assume at some level, behind closed doors, he's saying something else. But, what's your obligation, if ever, as a military leader in an operation that's largely failing, to say what to whom about this isn't really working so well? At what point do you get to say that? Do you ever say it in public? I don't know. Don't know the answer to that. But if you are a true professional, you might argue, and this is the thing that was being criticized as the MacArthur rule, that you have an obligation to the Constitution of the country that's bigger than to the current administration. There's an old JAG, Army JAG at Carlisle, likes to tell this story. He was the advisor to the Chief of Staff of the Army during Vietnam, and they're driving up to the hill, and he'd been told by the administration, whatever you do, don't admit that we're bombing in Cambodia. That's secret. So he said, Chief of Staff says, well, what do I do if they ask me that question under oath? He says, well, clutch your chest, fall to the floor, call me from Walter Reed, and we'll try to figure it out, right? And he likes to tell that story as if that's the right advice. I think that's exactly the wrong advice. I think the right advice is you work for the Congress too. And if you're under oath and they ask you a question, you have an obligation to answer the question. The administration may not like it, but it's not the idea that the sort of Ollie North rule, that because the president's commander-in-chief, you work only for him and you serve only his interests. That's an exactly wrong understanding of what commander-in-chief in the Constitution means. Should a senior military leader bow to the preference of administration to design an invasion with no plan for phase 4? I mean, is that inherently unethical? What are the options if you're the military leader in that case? And that's what the administration is telling you. I don't know the answer to that. That's why, remember I said, having laid out all this stuff, this is why this professional talk raises as many questions as it solves, it seems to me, and we haven't begun to think them through. So if you find yourself in this tough spot, what are your options in the current American system? Well, one that seems to work pretty well for senior people is to request retirement. There's no real tradition in the United States of resignation. By resignation, I mean walk in, put your stars on the table, say, forget my retirement, I'm out of here, I can't do it. Now, Earl Wheeler says in his book that he thought about it during the Vietnam War. He got almost to the brink of it, and then he told himself the usual thing, right? Well, somebody's going to have to run this thing. I should probably hang in here and try to do the best I can, even though I recognize it's not going very well. But it's an interesting question. Is there ever a case for resignation as opposed to early retirement? What about public criticism? Obviously not public criticism when you're in uniform. That would breach a major rule. But what if you're General Baptiste, just come out of the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan? You're now a retired guy, and suppose 3 weeks later they say you want to go to the Sunday talk shows and tell us what you think's the real deal in Afghanistan. Would that be, you could argue, would that be good for the country if people who actually know the military stuff, who are now in a position to do it, are able to inform the country of what's going badly? On the other hand, you could argue that this looks perilously undermining the administration and even undermining the troops you were just leading a few weeks before when you were in this job. I don't know the answer to this. Admiral Stockdale has a very interesting story in his own biography. He was airborne over the destroyer Turner Joy when ostensibly the second attack on Turner Joy that led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution happened. And he writes very clearly, he says, I was airborne over this ship. There was nothing there but American firepower and black water. You know? And I reported that up the chain of command. I said, we were not ever attacked on Turner Joy. And I saw it. As he put it, I had a front row seat to the whole thing. I know for a fact it didn't happen. I reported that accurately. Washington put me under a lot of pressure to change my story because they wanted a different story. Some of my colleagues did change the story. Said, I never did. I never changed that story. And then guess what? You get to fly the first attack into North Vietnam, right? And in his own mind, you know, that's the right way to split the difference. And I was honest. I told everybody everything I could, and now I'm under orders. I do what I'm being ordered to do. That's one to think about a lot. What about a retired guy like Jack Keane, who tell you, I'm sitting there watching the news, and I realize we're losing in Iraq. And he then designs the whole surge plan and sells it to the administration around all of the Joint Chiefs. In his view, that was my ethical obligation to try to salvage the Iraq situation. On the other hand, by the way, and then they offered to let him be in command of it. He refused to put the uniform back on. And then he said, and they said, okay, come to the White House as a civilian guy and run it. He said, I was making too much money in the corporate world to do that. So I didn't do any of those things, right? So I don't know. He gave a quite eloquent talk at Fort Leavenworth some years ago in which he still says, look, I realize what I did is morally ambiguous, but I thought it was my job to try to salvage the situation in Iraq. Well, the deeper question is, how well have we prepared our officers to even think about any of these questions? I would say very poorly. A book that I think is really good on this is my friend Mark Ociel, who's a lawyer, wrote a book called Obeying Orders, in which he says, look, what would it mean in practice if we took seriously the idea that not only should people disobey manifestly illegal orders, but we want to train them to do it. We want to train them to recognize them when they see them. What would the legal mechanisms look like to make that, acceptable or not? How could you do that in a way that was consistent with good order and discipline? I wouldn't necessarily say Mark got it perfectly right, but it's the only extended discussion of the question that I'm aware of, so I recommend it to all of you. Another question, this is moving off the professionalism stuff now. How do you square professional ethics with your personal moral convictions? One of the things that I think is really important to do if we talk this language of profession is to clearly distinguish what's a personal opinion, moral or religious, from what's truly a professional judgment. Another talk that Linnell Latondra gave at our place was really interesting. She was the legal advisor to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Task Force. And so General Ham, who was running that, asked her repeatedly, when, if ever, do I have to tell people what I personally think about this question? And so her legal advice, only if you are testifying under oath before a duly constituted body of the Congress. That's the only time you would ever have to do that. So whenever he was asked in press conferences or whatever, he would almost parrot-like repeat, I'll answer that when I'm asked that under oath before a duly constituted body of the Congress, right? So he goes all the way through, and the task force recommends the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and then he gets himself in this situation. He's now sworn in before a duly constituted body of the Congress. They asked him, he said, I'm personally opposed. I personally don't think we ought to do this. But that was not the question I was asked. I was asked the question, is this compatible with our professional obligations? Can it work for the military? So I gave my professional advice. My personal advice is, or my personal opinion is somewhere else, but not strictly relevant to the question. So for example, I've often said, with the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it's no secret that a lot of people in the service don't necessarily like this very much. But I say, look, the way I understand professional ethics is this. If you can't, in conscience, tell me you can lead gay and lesbian troops completely fairly and even-handedly, regardless of your personal convictions, there's the door. I mean, you don't belong in this profession anymore because you don't get to make the policy. The policy's been decided by other people. Your job is to implement it and to be professional. And if that's deeply inconsistent with your own personal values, that's perfectly okay, by the way. It just, you're in the wrong place. Go find somewhere else where you can act on those convictions. Another example, which I saw in spades at the Air Force Academy, is religious proselytizing in the workplace. I could give you hair-raising examples of specific things at the Air Force Academy during my time there that were just so, in fact, Admiral Rosa, and General Rosa, who was the superintendent at the time, said one of the great lines, he said, at this place, some people have been over the line so long, they're offended when you tell them where it is. So, conclusions. We need to do a much better job teaching and discussing constitutional ethics, I think. What it means to voluntarily subordinate personal convictions and beliefs to conscientious military service. What exactly does that mean? What exactly is the extent of the subordination? How do we strike that balance correctly? I don't think we talk about that much at all, and I think it's an absolutely vital question for the health of the profession. We need to more clearly articulate the requirement to refuse manifestly illegal orders. So for example, Charlie, I think, mentioned today, the JAGs at Guantanamo were kind of a great example of this, right? They went so far as to ask the New York Bar Association to please sue us about the military commission process because we think our clients should be allowed to see the evidence against them and be given a fair trial. And we think the system we're being asked to run is not a fair trial. So we are willing to go outside the system to fight it. But notice they had an advantage. They were dual-hatted professionals, right? So they had their own legal ethic that bore heavily on them. For the regular line officer, you don't necessarily have a second hat that you can appeal to, so it's got to come out of your own internal ethic. As the gulf between civilians and the military grows, how do we ensure that the nation as a whole takes ownership of what we ask our military to do? Because I think we really don't. I mean, that's part of the problem Andy was talking about. If we, as a country, felt that we were at war and that we were losing people that we understood and cared about and knew about, and having them injured, we would be paying a lot more attention to whether this is working. We'd be paying a lot more attention to whether what we're being asked to do is reasonable. I fear that we're rapidly evolving to something like the French Foreign Legion, which you can send off to do stuff and not feel you have any skin in the game at all. To what degree does the size and engagement of the U.S. military in recent decades legitimate some of the founders' concern, or is all of this OBE by now, right? That was then, this is now. The Constitution is basically a dead letter on these questions, and we just need to learn to live with that. Is that the right answer? It's a dangerous answer if it's the right answer, but it is de facto what we're doing, right? So there's that. How should we assess the lack of strategic success in our most recent uses of military force, ethically, both on the just war side and in our obligations toward our own military personnel to use them wisely? Is that an obligation that we have, and if so, how do we exercise it? So I think that's a good point to stop. We have about 20 minutes for discussion. You've been very patient. I know it's the end of a long 2 days and a Friday afternoon, but if there are any questions, please. Yeah, Mark.
Thank you very much. You talked a lot about military as a profession.
Yep.
You talked about civilian control of the military. I'm wondering, is there a civilian profession, and what is that?
No.
No?
No.
So what kind of civilian can take the kind of control or ownership that you're looking for?
The one who gets elected.
Say again?
The one who gets elected. That's our system, right? The one who gets elected.
Okay, that I understood.
Or appointed by the person who got elected.
Right. Broader, I mean, you've talked about having more skin in the game as
Yeah.
a civilian population. Is there more to it than that? Simply having skin in the game? Have we lost a measure of what it means to be a citizen?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So that's what I'm getting at.
Yep. No, it's a very serious problem. I don't know how to fix it. I do think some of what Carl Merlantes has to say about trying to facilitate more honest dialogue between military people and veterans and the rest of the society would be a good thing. But the truth is, I think most Americans, for them, the military is out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
Yeah, Midshipman, please.
Sir, I had a question. You said we need to do a much better job of educating the officer corps about constitutional ethics and things like subordinating personal morality. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that should be something that's taught versus something that's screened for upon entering, becoming an officer training program?
I think it has to be taught. I mean, this is where I get to play the old guy card, but I think, when I went through school, we had a semester-long civics course where you actually went through all this Constitution stuff and all that. I don't think your generation gets that, right, in high school?
Sometimes.
Sometimes? Yeah. Well, even if you get it, you wouldn't necessarily get it in its direct military application, right? So at least when I taught at the Air Force Academy, several lessons in the core philosophy course were about this stuff, about the constitutional stuff. And I discovered to my horror that the law department didn't actually teach it. So it had to be taught by the philosophy department, because the law department was teaching much more, military law kinds of stuff, and not really addressing constitutional issues. So I think not only you have to teach it to you at the academy, I think there has to be a kind of ongoing periodic engagement with it. I mean, one of the things we're thinking about in the Navy is one of the things that the social science literature shows, if you want to improve ethical conduct throughout an organization, one of the most effective things to do is just talk about it a lot. Not talk about it at length, but just routinely mention it. So, for example, there was a study that a guy named Dan Ariely did, and he discovered if students took a test and it says at the top of the test, "I'm taking this test in accordance with the MIT honor code," cheating goes way down, even though MIT doesn't even have an honor code. Just saying that, reminding you, just that little framing remark is pretty effective. And so I think if commanders at every level routinely, and I don't mean get up and give a PowerPoint speech for an hour, I mean just routinely talk about the ethic, the nature of the role that you're in, What is the purpose of the military? You know, what is the overarching meaning framework in which you do what you do? That would be really important, and I think that's where we're hoping that the Navy's going to go. The current CNO says, we originally said we were going to try to run some of this out of the Navy Leadership and Ethics Center, and he said, I don't want that. I want this to go out to the fleet. I want commanders at every level to own this. And the problem with that, of course, is the commanders at every level don't know how to own it. They don't have the vocabulary to talk about it. They don't have the materials to do it. So that's NLEC's job, is to give that stuff to them. But that's what Admiral Richardson has in mind as the way he's going to try to address this throughout the Navy. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I guess what prompted it is that we take this semester-long ethics course here, our second year, and it seems like when we do a unit on constitutional ethics, and it seems like for people, a lot of people don't really accept it. They kind of feel entitled to their own, whatever their own morality has been on that topic. They'll listen. Yes, the Constitution's supposed to trump your personal morality and stuff, but they also kind of think they're entitled to their own personal morality in a lot of things, and it's hard to actually know if we've understood it.
Well, I'd say a couple things about that. One is just developmental psychological, right? You're at a stage of life where the number one goal in psychological terms is individuation, right? Who are you, as distinct from my family, my parents, my siblings, right? So that's kind of the big agenda of the early 20s, developmentally. So being really focused on who am I, and what do I value, what do I care about, is perhaps not totally inappropriate for your stage of life. On the other hand, if you don't walk out of that with a clear understanding about it, when you put up your right hand, you've given up a lot of moral autonomy. You know, then you just haven't thought about this, right? I mean, you just don't understand the nature of what you're about to do, and that I think is distressing. So somebody should make it pretty brutally clear to folks that that's the wrong answer, because you're not going to be able to get away with it. Yeah.
First of all, I really appreciate this talk. It was just terrific, and I think that you have hit all the crucial issues. One thing that I'm wondering what your view is, it seems to me that there's a different sense of what it is for the military to be a profession when you're talking first about top leadership who are interacting with the media and with politicians and more generally with the public, which are a number of your examples. Second, what I see around me, to me, as somebody who teaches law students as my regular job, I mean, this looks like a professional school to me, in which the mids are studying, they're bringing up a lot of different, learning a lot of different competences and professional ethics and the law that governs what they do. I mean, this is like law school or medical school. But that strikes me as a different kind of professionalism than the professionalism of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Sure. Well, I think.
The one that to me is the real question mark is I don't know what it means, what it is mean, what professional means when we're talking about the enlisted ranks, which aren't going through professional training. I mean, they get the technical expertise to do what they're doing, and I don't know, maybe they get 2 hours of PowerPoints about ethics and law. Maybe they don't. But I just don't know what professional means in that sense. And I'm wondering if you think that the military as a profession means 3 different things or one thing or 1.5.
Yours about 8 questions there, Dan. So let me see. First of all, about mids and cadets. In a perfect world, they would see themselves as junior members of the profession. You know, when I taught at a medical school when I was really in my 20s. And there's something that when you walk into med school, one of the big ceremonies is putting on your white coat, right? It's a big ceremony, and so that's a visible signal to you that as of this day, you were a junior member of a profession that has its own ethic and so forth, right? Now, in a perfect world, cadets and midshipmen would see themselves as junior members of the military profession. But in my experience, most of them don't. Partly it's because of the highly regulated nature of the academies, that they tend to perceive it as an us and them situation. There are all these rules the academy's imposing on me, and I don't want to get in trouble with them, but it's their rules, you know, and I'm really a college kid in funny clothes, just trying to get through the system, right? So I think there's that tension at the academy levels. But I think the academies could do a better job of articulating that than they do. In fact, who was I talking to just last night? Oh, when the Air Force adopted this PEDO program a few years ago, borrowed from the Army's Cadet Leadership Development System. But the Air Force didn't really implement it very well, and the Parliament Party didn't really know how to do it, and so forth. One of the big challenges, just practically, with trying to spread this professionalism language, is if you put on your sociology hat, you're right, it's the officer corps who are really the professional. And not even everybody in the officer corps, right? Because there are a lot of ancillary things that get done by officers that aren't really the core competencies of the profession as a profession of arms. And when the Army started down this road, they started with that, because Don's a sociologist and he came at this with a very clear sociological articulation of it. The political problem was, and I was actually at the meeting, where the NCO said, "What are you saying? I'm not a professional?" Because there's this other looser sense of professional, right? Of, you mean I'm not, competent and to be respected and so forth. And eventually even the civilians said this too. So as a practical matter, the Army ended up throwing up its hands and saying, "You're all members of the Army profession." Okay? But that's a tension between intellectual clarity and political reality.
Yeah, to me, like, for the 18-year-old who enlists, says, well, now I'm a professional, I don't think that carries all the same connotations of now I have a professional ethic, now I have a client, a relationship to a client.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we might want it to be that way, but it's hard for me to imagine that the 18-year-old sees it that way. It's a job, it's a career. I have professional skills that I'm getting from it, but otherwise it's kind of like the guy who comes and sprays my rose bushes who has painted on the side of his van. I'm a professional.
Well, I think part of it is how we articulate it for them, right? And do we articulate frequently enough? But I agree with you, we don't do a very good job of it, but we could do better. So, for example, John and I were talking to the officer cadet school one day, and they said, "Well, what do you do when these guys arrive on the weekend?" I said, "Well, we check them in, we weigh them, we measure their height, we put them through a various things, and then on Monday we start with these training programs." I said, "You got Sunday, right? Why don't you use Sunday to talk about the Constitution, the oath, what it is they're joining, why they're joining it, how to think about that?" And the reaction was kind of like the old V8 commercial. Why did I never think of that? So they started doing it, and they found it made an enormous difference, just making a point of framing the activity in a way that made sense. And you'd have to do it repeatedly, right? Not just once, but in fact, we don't do a very good job of it at the academy. Yeah.
This is a topic you and I talked about. Most of military ethics education is focused on character, what you might call virtue ethics, which is critically important. But as we know, there's a lot of psychological research, behavioral psychology that suggests there are various ways in which character can be undermined in these situations.
Or encouraged.
Or encouraged, right? Different kinds of cues can elicit different kinds of behavior. Do you see sort of growing awareness of that in the military, and to the extent that it is, how would you see that incorporated into?
Yeah. I talk about it all the time. I'll give you the one example I like best. This is from Dan Ariely's book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, which is a really fun read if you haven't read it. He did a study of cheating among college students. And the experiment is students come into a room, they sit at a desk, and there are a set of math problems, and there are envelopes full of money at each desk. And they are asked to solve as many problems as they can in a certain amount of time, to tear up the answer sheet so they can appear to cheat with impunity if they want, and then pay themselves a certain amount for each solved problem. In that default situation, most people cheat a little bit, pay themselves like one or two problems more than they solve. Nobody takes all the money. And his theory about this is, we all have what he calls a personal fudge factor. You want to feel okay about yourself, but you're willing to bend it a little bit. I'll drive 5, maybe 10 miles over the speed limit, but not 40. I want to feel kind of okay. And then he does an experiment on this. He said he puts an actor in the room, and as soon as the experiment is explained, the experimenter leaves the room, and the actor says, "I've solved them all," takes the entire envelope of money and exits. Right? And so the question is, will the presence of this actor increase or decrease cheating in the study group? Guess? Okay, here's the remarkable answer. This is why I love the social science stuff, because it's all so counterintuitive. It depends what sweatshirt the actor wears. The experiment was done at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And if the actor wears a Carnegie Mellon sweatshirt, then in fact the cheating goes up. But if they wear a Pitt sweatshirt, the school on the other side of town, it goes down below the baseline in the initial experiment. It goes to practically nothing, right? And so the best hypothesis to explain this, of course, is that you want to feel better than those guys, right? Now, I talk about this to the major command course in the Navy every time, because look, one thing we know for sure about military organizations, it's about the sweatshirt, man. You know, it's what your group is tolerating that's going to become the de facto norm. And if you've been around in military units anytime, you know as you move from one to the other, it's different. The de facto ethic is different, depending on the unit that you're in. So, you know, the Navy right now has the biggest scandal in decades, the so-called Fat Leonard scandal. It's going to be the gift that keeps on giving. Is we got dozens of officers under investigation for bribery and prostitution and all kinds of stuff out of the Pacific Command. But bet you dollars to donuts, for most of those guys, the best explanation is a sweatshirt explanation. They got out to PACOM and said, this is how we do business with Fat Leonard and PACOM. And unless you're a saint or a hero, you just don't kind of fit in with the ambient standard, right? And I think it's now. Okay, one more question, and Reed had it, so go ahead.
I'll change my question. I'm going to ask something else, but I'll ask you this. So a historical example of the failure of the constitutional model, the biggest one, I think, and I wonder if you study this, is, from what I've read, in the antebellum officer corps, the assumption that Southern officers would defect from their union and their branch of service to join the Confederacy if secession came was left unchallenged and unquestioned. That this, we understand you're from Alabama, Alabama secedes, you're going to go constitutional oath, which has been in effect, I think, since 1789 in one form or another, be damned. You're going to go with your regional affiliation. I was just wondering if the study, and I think that's the biggest failure of constitutional ethics, probably in American military history.
Yeah. I think part of
I can think of is that worth studying or pondering as an example to talk about now.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, look, I'm no great historian on this, but 2 points, I guess. You know, at that time, people still referred to their state as their country. You know, Lee said, my country is Virginia. You know, so there's that. And the country collectively was referred to as these United States. The plural, the notion being that your loyalty would. I believe it's Lincoln who changed the terminology to the United States, focusing on the national unity. So I guess that would be an explanation of why that seemed to be a largely unquestioned okay thing at the time, that the country had only semi-gelled in terms of, you know, the relationship of the federal government to the states. Of course, we solved that one once and for all, right? I mean, I'm joking, of course. Yeah. All right, we're out of time. It's Friday afternoon. Thank you. You've been very patient.
So we have the famous Stockdale moral compass here to give to Dr. Cook, and I had heard rumors, and Dr. Cook just said it was true, that he'll be going out to the Air Force Academy in a little bit to assist them. And so he didn't need the moral compass up at Newport with the Navy, but going to the Air Force place, he's probably going to need this to keep those guys on track. But actually, I hope when he looks at it at his desk, he'll be reminded of how many officers that are out in the fleet, operating forces, Army, all these services that do have a solid moral compass because of the investment he's made in those individuals. So I want to thank you again for wrapping us up well. Thank you, sir. And I want to thank you all for participating in all the ways you have. I hope you've made some good connections with people you didn't know before. 2 admonitions to end. One is, in our sphere of influence, based on what we've heard over these 2 days, what do we change? Whether it's at a school or out in the fleet or as a midshipman? What do we do differently as we think about these many issues that have been raised about civil-military relationships? And then I think I've been convinced that there's an individual piece as well. If we want America to be more serious about this, what's our responsibility as individuals to help that along? And I think we all need to think about that if we really want to see change going forward. So again, thank you for being with us here at the Naval Academy, and God bless you all, and have a safe trip going back to wherever you are going back to.